Emonitor plotting. Part 1, Single Plot Basics. This video is part of a two-part series that demonstrates some of Emonitor's extensive plotting capabilities. In this first video, we'll focus on working with single plots and demonstrate some of the options available within each plot type. In the second video, we'll take a look at some of Emonitor's pre-configured multiple plot views, which really allow the vibration analyst to leverage the power of Emonitor. So be sure to also watch Part 2, Exploring Plot Views. So let's go check out the basics. One of the most direct ways to display a single plot in Emonitor is to simply right-click on a measurement here in the measurement pane and select Show Data from the right-click menu. Here we have just a basic trend plot, and you can see we have some alarm thresholds turned on. Now, by default, an Emonitor plot will not show you the alarm thresholds. That's something that you can turn on if that's something you wish to do by default. To get to plot options, we would double-click in any of the plot margins. If I double-click in the y-axis, it will open up the plot options and it will focus on the y-axis tab. But here we can access any of the other major plot options as well. I'll cancel that. Let's take a look at some of the elements in this plot. Here we have our y-axis units, inches per second. Here we have, it says none. This actually represents what the filter setting is on the particular measurement. So if you had, say, a smart high-pass filter applied to this measurement, that would be reflected in this label above. We can look at the amplitudes in their default collection spec signal detection of peak, or we can double-click this and look at the amplitudes in peak to peak, or also RMS, if so desired. We have the ability to zoom in. We call this a rubber band zoom. If you right-click the mouse and hold and drag a box over the area you wish to zoom in, when you release the mouse button, it zooms in that area for you. On plots where you have thousands of data points, this can sometimes be helpful to zoom in on things of interest. To get back to the plot's original format, there's a little box down here in the lower left-hand corner. You can double-click that box and it returns the plot back to its original format. The other option is to simply close the plot and reopen it. That also works. So this is the basics of the trend plot. Let's go take a look at another common plot type. Doing the same right-click Show Data on a spectrum measurement will bring up an Fft spectrum. Here you can see I have not enabled the alarm thresholds by default. I'll double-click in the margin to bring that up. And to turn on alarms, we have several options. I'll go to the Alarms tab, and we have two different alarm types on Spectrum. We have the band alarm, which if I activate that, I will hold my Control key down and select critical as well, and I'll show those two alarm types. So common band alarms. If I wanted to save this as my default view, I could click OK, and then I would come under the plot menu item and say Save as Default. By doing that, anytime I now open up an Fft spectrum, it will show me the warning and critical band alarms if those alarms are defined on that particular measurement. If they're not defined, no alarms will show. Going back into our plot options, there's another alarm type that we can choose to display. It's a spectrum alarm, which is simply an enveloping alarm. And to show you what that looks like, you can see the spectrum alarm draws a profile around a baseline spectrum measurement, and you define the offsets of the amplitude, how far off either side and on top from amplitude and frequency standpoint, and it draws a type profile, however you specify, across the entire frequency range of the spectrum. We'll go ahead and take the alarms off to make it a little bit easier to look at. Let's take a look while we're in here at some other options. Under Styles, I have the option to include the grid lines. I can also include a band overall amplitude, which adds a bar over here on the far right-hand side of the FFT plot. If I put a cursor on this bar, it will show me an amplitude value in the lower x-axis margin. We can also show legend, which will show up here in the upper right-hand corner. On frequencies, we can opt to show frequencies and visually align the frequency labels. Under Cursor, we can turn a display cursor on by default. It's off by default, normally, until you click on the plot. And then you can affect the appearance of the cursor as well. On the x-axis options, our default scaling type is linear, as shown by the lin label up here in the upper left-hand corner. You can do a logarithmic scaling type as well. You can also set the axis minimum value and maximum value here. Usually we let the exact auto scaling handle this automatically. On the y-axis tab, again, we can set the minimum and maximum amplitudes if so desired, but typically we allow these to be calculated automatically and the scaling set accordingly. On the data tab, we have the option to do overlays, where you can actually tag multiple spectra if desired and lay them on top of each other to see how different they are. Sometimes that can be a view that's a little difficult to read, and there are other ways to compare spectra, which I'll get into in part 2. Some other interesting things to be aware of. With any plot, and as with actually the vast majority of functionality within Emonitor, you can hit the F1 function key and it will bring up context-sensitive help. In this case, since we happen to be looking at a spectrum plot, it brings up the help screen for spectrum plots. And it describes every region in the plot. And if you scroll down a little further, you can see all the different types of cursors that we have access to. Harmonic cursors, operating speed, sideband cursors, peak cursors. There's a bearing cursor where you can estimate bearing frequencies if you don't happen to have those already predefined in your frequency items. F1 is definitely a go-to tool here when you're just getting started. Let's take a look at some of these cursors. If I put a single cursor on a peak here, this is usually our running speed peak, the far left-hand side tallest peak. Not always the case, but typically so. If I hit the H key to bring up the harmonic cursor, I can take a look and see what peaks align with harmonics of the running speed. And here we can see our 2 times, our 3 times, and our 4 times. And what might jump out to somebody who's a vibration analyst is the fact that this peak does not actually align as a harmonic. So we might be wondering, what exactly is that peak? I can put the cursor on this peak, click the frequency label at the top, and Emonitor tells me this is the blade pass frequency, which is actually not a harmonic of running speed. Now, how does it know about blade pass? Well, that's covered in the frequency item setup. If you're interested in learning more about that, we have a video called Frequency Items. Just like in the trend plot, we also have a rubber band zoom. So if we wanted to zoom in on a couple of peaks, we can right-click and hold, draw a box, and we can zoom in on those peaks. This is particularly helpful when you have a very high-resolution spectrum of, say, 1600 lines or more, where sometimes peaks are difficult to differentiate in the standard view. And once again, there's a sort of invisible box in the lower left-hand corner here, where you can double-click and return the plot to its original format. Incidentally, when looking at frequency items, we could choose, if we wanted to show all of the frequency items by clicking on the one with the 1x label on it. And as you can see, if we have a lot of frequencies defined, sometimes these can be very close and overlap and make the labels hard to read. If you only have a few frequencies defined, this view is pretty handy because you can see everything at once. Another cursor that's kind of interesting is the Sideband Cursor. Now, if I put a cursor on a peak of interest, sometimes we will get sidebands showing up in our spectra. And we might want to know, as a vibration analysis, what is the distance in CPM or hertz or orders or whatever units we're working in. What is the distance from that sideband to its primary peak in the middle? One way to do this is to use the sideband cursor. So after I place the main cursor, I hit the S key. I'm going to hold the control key down and then the right arrow key to slowly bring in the sideband lines. And what I'm going to do is line up this first sideband up with this peak right here. And right when it's on that peak, that tells me I've got it lined up pretty well. And actually this interval here is fairly common for sideband energy. And it tells me the delta, so I know that 135 CPM is the distance of that sideband from that particular frequency peak. As a vibration analyst, that's important information to know. In the plot options, you have the ability on sideband cursors to define how many sidebands you wish to be able to cursor. You can reduce or increase that number as needed. And the same goes for harmonic cursors as well. Let's take a look at one more basic plot type. This would be the time waveform. So we'll right-click on a time waveform measurement, and we'll say Show Data. And now we've got a simple time waveform plot. And again, we have the same kinds of options with rubber band zoom, to zoom in on a specific area of the time waveform. We can double-click in that little hidden spot down there to return it back to its normal position. You can see when we place the cursor anywhere here, it shows us the amplitude at that position, and it also shows us, the amplitude at both the X and the Y position, as well as the timestamp of the time waveform itself. In the plot options for a time waveform, we have most of the same things you would find in the other plots as well. The ability to overlay, set minimum and maximum values, change the cursor types. You can choose to turn on the alarms, and you can choose to include the legend or the grid lines. In this case, I've added the legend by default and saved that as my default for the time waveform plot. And that also speaks to another topic here. The plots are very customizable. You can change all of the color patterns in here. If you don't like our particular default color choices, you can come up under plot and you're able to modify colors for every element on the plot. So you can make these look really however you want them to look, and then you can save those changes. Of course, if you don't like your changes, you can always come back in here and go back to the default value. So that covers the basics of Emonitor plotting with single plots. Let's go on to part 2 and explore Emonitor's multiple plot views. Thanks for watching.